Miles Rennard and his shadowy network rewrote the rules of crime, turning a quiet Liverpool shipping company into a global empire of smuggling, money laundering and cyber warfare. This is the untold story of how the UK's most ruthless mafia vanished into the digital abyss, leaving governments powerless and entire industries shaken to their core. In the early 2000s, the Liverpool docks bustled with activity like they had for centuries. Cargo ships came and went, unloading crates of goods from around the world. Among them was a small shipping company that had recently set up shop in a quiet corner of the port. It dealt mainly in seafood, cod, haddock, frozen prawns and the occasional luxury shellfish for restaurants in London. The business seemed unremarkable. The books were clean, taxes filed without delay, and safety inspections passed without question. To the outside world, it was just another humble link in the UK's import-export chain. But not everything inside those crates was what it seemed. Hidden beneath layers of ice-packed fish were secret compartments filled with weapons, narcotics, and high-grade counterfeit currency. Machine guns wrapped in waterproof lining sat inches away from frozen shrimp. Tightly packed bundles of synthetic drugs were stored in vacuum-sealed bags, masked by the scent of seafood. In some shipments, stacks of nearly flawless fake euros were disguised as packaging insulation. The concealment was clever, almost elegant, and no one suspected a thing. Authorities had no reason to look closer. It was just fish. This quiet operation was the first node in what would become one of the most powerful criminal enterprises the modern world had ever seen. But behind it all wasn't some street-hardened gangster or notorious crime family. The man pulling the strings had once worn tailored suits, walked the trading floors of Canary Wharf, and managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions. His name was Miles Rennard, a former investment banker whose fall from grace was as quiet as his return was explosive. In 1998, Rennard had vanished from the financial world after being quietly implicated in a high-level insider trading scandal. Though he was never charged, the whispers were enough to ruin his career. His name disappeared from financial headlines, his townhouse in Kensington was sold, and associates assumed he had left the country in disgrace. In reality, he hadn't just left the system, he'd begun planning how to beat it. 3 years later, the Liverpool Shipping Company appeared. It was incorporated under a shell corporation, registered in the Isle of Man, with no obvious ties to Rennard. Its listed director was a middle-aged fisherman, with no previous business experience. The company's startup capital was traced to a failed tech firm in Estonia. On paper, it was just one of many obscure businesses moving goods through Europe. In practice, it was the seed of an empire. Rennard used his financial background to structure everything like a legitimate multinational. He understood how to move money without raising flags, how to disguise ownership behind layers of legal fog, and how to use the complexity of global trade to his advantage. Every transaction had a paper trail, one that led nowhere useful. Every shipping route was designed to pass through jurisdictions with weak oversight. It wasn't just a smuggling operation, it was a lesson in misdirection. For years no one looked twice. Customs inspectors saw boxes of seafood. Accountants saw tidy balance sheets. The only ones who noticed anything strange were rival criminals, small-time smugglers who started losing territory. But when they tried to interfere, they disappeared, quietly and permanently. Miles Rennard had found the perfect front, and no one had any idea what was really coming. Miles Rennard had once been a man who studied numbers. In the cold glass towers of London's financial district, he had learned how wealth moved invisibly through systems most people didn't understand. He knew which loopholes could hide billions, how markets could be manipulated without a trace, and how a well-placed transaction could change everything. But when he was forced out of that world, he didn't just retreat, he transformed. After vanishing from public life, Rennard spent 3 years in silence. During that time, he studied not just crime, but the systems that failed to detect it. He read about how cartels laundered money through art auctions, how arms dealers moved weapons through diplomatic channels, and how governments unintentionally sheltered criminals through bureaucracy. While the world assumed he was disgraced, he was laying the foundation for something far more ambitious than any hedge fund or investment portfolio. He wasn't planning to re-enter the financial world. He was planning to build his own version of it, lawless, invisible, and deeply profitable. He called the organization Blackshore, though that name never appeared in public records. It existed only in whispered conversations, encrypted emails, and burner phones passed between men who rarely used their real names. Blackshore wasn't a gang, it wasn't a cartel. It was structured like a corporation. Every operation was a department. Every smuggling route was a supply chain. Every illegal service was a product. And like any good company, it started by recruiting the right talent. Rennard didn't want gangsters, he wanted professionals. He used contacts from his banking days to identify disgraced lawyers who knew international law but had lost their licenses. He found ex-military men discharged under suspicious circumstances, snipers, demolitions experts, and logistics officers with experience in war zones. From the shadowy corners of online forums, he recruited hackers who had already broken into banks and government systems for sport. He gave them structure, purpose, and most importantly, money. Each recruit was carefully vetted. Some were offered wealth beyond anything they had imagined. Others were blackmailed with secrets Rennard somehow already knew. Loyalty wasn't optional. Those who accepted became part of something larger. Those who didn't, disappeared. Blackshore's operations expanded fast. What started with smuggling weapons through the Liverpool docks quickly evolved. Rennard established ghost companies across Europe and Asia. These fronts imported and exported real goods, textiles, minerals, electronics, but inside each shipment was something else. Drugs were hidden in plastic pellets. Counterfeit passports were tucked inside crates of books. Stolen art was shipped as home decor. What made Blackshore different wasn't what it did, it was how it operated. Every move was calculated. Transactions were layered between multiple currencies, shell companies, and fake names. Operations were compartmentalized. No one ever saw the whole picture. From the outside it all looked legitimate. From the inside it was a machine built for one purpose, to make money through crime and never get caught. By the mid-2000s, Blackshore was already bigger than most realized. Authorities hadn't even heard the name, but within the underworld, whispers had begun. A new player had entered the game, cold, corporate, and dangerously efficient, and no one knew who was behind it. By 2005, Blackshore was no longer confined to the UK. What began in a Liverpool dockyard had grown into a sprawling international network. But unlike traditional crime syndicates that fought for territory with violence and threats, Blackshore moved through the world quietly, using money, leverage, and carefully planned logistics. It wasn't interested in street wars or local dominance. Its ambition was global. Rennard saw an opportunity in places most corporations avoided, regions marked by political instability, weak institutions, and ongoing conflict. West Africa, in particular, caught his attention. Countries there were rich in resources, diamonds, gold, coltan, and other minerals essential for electronics and industrial manufacturing. But those same countries were plagued by civil wars, corrupt regimes, and desperate militias. Where others saw chaos, Rennard saw supply and demand. Blackshore began by offering weapons to rebel groups. Shipments of small arms, ammunition and explosives flowed through secondary ports under the radar of international watchdogs. In return, Rennard demanded not cash, but access to mines, trade routes, and territorial control. Some local warlords resisted, but not for long. Blackshore's weapons gave their enemies the upper hand, and soon deals were struck with whoever was left standing. Once access was secured, Blackshore funneled the raw materials out through a maze of legal and illegal shipping channels. A ton of coltan would leave Africa under false customs documents, routed through a chain of intermediaries in Turkey, the UAE, or Singapore before arriving in Europe or Asia labeled as industrial scrap or recycled goods. From there it entered legitimate markets. The profits were enormous. Meanwhile, Rennard expanded another arm of his empire, cybercrime. Using his team of elite hackers, he orchestrated targeted attacks on banks, financial firms and government agencies. These weren't crude data breaches or noisy ransomware strikes. These were precise, silent infiltrations. Money was siphoned in small, unnoticeable amounts. Corporate secrets were stolen and sold to competitors. Identities were harvested and resold on the dark web. At one point, Blackshore even gained access to the internal systems of a European central bank for nearly 2 weeks. Millions were redirected into shell companies before anyone noticed. The bank never disclosed the breach, fearing reputational damage. Rennard's fingerprints were nowhere to be found. To handle the growing flow of illicit funds, Blackshore created a network of underground financial service providers, rogue accountants, complicit bankers, and offshore firms willing to look the other way. Bribes were disguised as consulting fees. Illegal transactions were buried within legitimate mergers. Through careful layering and integration, Blackshore transformed blood diamonds and hacked data into clean, usable capital. The organization's reach extended further than most governments knew. In West Africa, it wasn't uncommon for entire towns to rely on Blackshore's payments. Some local officials, quietly on the payroll, turned a blind eye. Others actively helped maintain the illusion of order. Blackshore became embedded in the economy like a parasite that also fed its host. By the end of the decade, Rennard's empire controlled supply chains that touched every continent. From smuggled gold in Ghana to shell companies in Liechtenstein, from dark web marketplaces to luxury London real estate, Blackshore was everywhere. And still, almost no one in law enforcement knew it existed. As Blackshore expanded across continents, its operations became increasingly complex. Illegal shipments were no longer hidden in seafood crates or marked as scrap metal. Now they passed through multinational contracts, legal trade agreements, and elaborate licensing frameworks. The more the organization grew, the more it needed protection, not just from the law but from the law itself. And for that, Miles Rennard turned to the one group that knew exactly how to shield power: lawyers. He didn't recruit ordinary legal minds. He sought out the broken, the brilliant, and the desperate. Some had once worked at the most prestigious firms in London and New York before being struck off for misconduct. Others had defended criminals in high-profile cases before mysteriously dropping out of sight. Rennard found them all, with promises of untouchable wealth, or threats only he could make. He assembled a team of legal operatives, who would become the architects of Blackshore's invisibility. They built walls of paperwork taller than any prison fence. Each company, under Blackshore's umbrella, was protected by layers of legal fiction, trusts registered in offshore havens, holding firms nested inside one another like Russian dolls, and contracts drafted to hide true ownership behind coded language. The lawyers worked in silence, often unaware of the criminal activities they were actually shielding. Those who started asking too many questions received warnings. Those who ignored them were dealt with quietly. In 2008, one of Blackshore's lawyers took a skiing trip to Switzerland and never returned. His body was never found, but authorities suspected an avalanche, a tragic accident. Weeks later, his London office caught fire. Investigators blamed faulty wiring, but within that charred space were boxes of confidential files, documents that linked several real estate transactions in Eastern Europe to shell companies tied to Blackshore. The case was closed within days. There were no follow-up. Internally, Blackshore referred to this type of action as a containment protocol. It wasn't common, but it was permanent. After that incident, the remaining legal team operated with new discipline. They asked fewer questions. They encrypted everything. They destroyed every draft, every note, and worked only through secure in-person handovers. No one kept records. No one stored files. Everything existed in fragments, scattered across different jurisdictions, impossible to piece together. Rennard ensured that the lawyers never met each other. Each handled a specific region or operation. One oversaw Blackshore's real estate dealings in Asia. Another specialized in maritime shipping contracts. A third created backdated legal justifications for previously completed transactions. They believed they were working for separate clients, small firms, wealthy individuals, or anonymous trusts. Only Rennard knew the full picture. These legal shields allowed Blackshore to walk through walls. When a customs agency flagged a suspicious shipment, the paperwork always checked out. When a journalist followed a trail of shell companies, it ended in a meaningless offshore trust. And when authorities tried to freeze assets, they found nothing but empty shells, because the money had already moved. The lawyers weren't just defending criminals, they were building a fortress around a shadow empire. one brick at a time, and no one outside that fortress even knew it existed. In 2015, the first real maritime shipping contracts, a third created backdated legal justifications for previously completed transactions. They believed they were working for separate clients, small firms, wealthy individuals, or anonymous trusts. Only Rennard knew the full picture. These legal shields allowed Blackshore to walk through walls. When a customs agency flagged a suspicious shipment, the paperwork always checked out. When a journalist followed a trail of shell companies, it ended in a meaningless offshore trust, and when authorities tried to freeze assets, they found nothing but empty shells, because the money had already moved. The lawyers weren't just defending criminals, they were building a fortress around a shadow empire, one brick at a time, and no one outside that fortress even knew it existed. In 2015, the first real crack in Blackshore's armor appeared, not from a failed operation or an informant, but from something far more unpredictable, a warehouse fire. It started in a logistics hub, near the port of Rotterdam, one of the busiest shipping centers in Europe. The building belonged to a mid-sized freight company, registered in Denmark, contracted to store and transfer industrial machinery. At least that's what the manifests claim. The fire itself was short-lived. Local fire crews arrived quickly and extinguished the flames before they could spread. On the surface, it looked like a minor electrical fault, one of dozens that happen in warehouses every year. But as the smoke cleared and investigators walked through the charred remnants, they discovered cargo that didn't match any of the listed inventory. What they found was shocking. Inside several containers, hidden behind stacks of legitimate equipment, were assault rifles, chemical precursors used in drug production, forged identity documents, and over 20 million in near-perfect counterfeit currency. The crates were marked as hydraulic pumps and industrial compressors. The labels were authentic, and the paperwork appeared clean until it didn't. Customs officials began tracing the shipment backward. The trail zigzagged through multiple ports, including Tangier, Valletta and Limassol, before disappearing into a chain of shell companies, with no real offices, no staff and no online presence. Alarm bells started ringing. Within days, Europol, Interpol, and several national agencies were involved. It was the largest seizure of its kind in years, and no one could explain how such dangerous cargo had moved across so many borders undetected. Investigators began digging deeper into the Danish freight company. Its ownership structure was convoluted, with holding firms registered in the Cayman Islands, and nominee directors based in Belize. Financial records showed large transactions from unknown sources, routed through cryptocurrency wallets and obscure banks in Eastern Europe. What had looked like a minor shipping outfit was quickly revealed to be part of something much larger. At first, law enforcement believed they were dealing with a major organized crime syndicate, perhaps a new offshoot of an Eastern European cartel. But the more they pulled on the threads, the stranger the pattern became. The legal documents were flawless, the counterfeit cash was nearly undetectable, the routes were planned with military precision. Nothing felt like street crime, it felt like strategy. For the first time, international agencies had a clear target. They began coordinating efforts, pooling intelligence, and issuing warrants. Arrests were made in Spain, Malta and the Netherlands. But as quickly as doors opened, they slammed shut. Witnesses disappeared, assets were empty, trails went cold. Then came a revelation no one expected. The fire hadn't been an accident at all. Surveillance footage recovered weeks later showed a man entering the warehouse through a maintenance door just hours before the blaze. The fire had been set deliberately. Investigators had walked straight into a trap, a planned leak, designed to distract, mislead or eliminate a compromised operation. By the time they realized it, Blackshore was already gone. The ports had gone quiet. The company had dissolved. Its online presence, the operation had shifted, like smoke through cracks in a wall. The Rotterdam fire wasn't the beginning of the end. It was proof that the empire had already moved on. After the Rotterdam fire, law enforcement scrambled to make sense of what they had uncovered. Teams across Europe traced shell companies and banking records, chasing the faint outlines of an operation that had already shifted shape. But while investigators focused on weapons and counterfeit cash, Blackshore had quietly entered a new phase, one that was even harder to detect. Rennard had realized early on that illegal money was only useful if it could be made to look clean. Washing hundreds of millions through small businesses or offshore accounts was no longer enough. The empire had outgrown the shadows. Now it needed architecture. And so began Blackshore's move into real estate, vast, gleaming and nearly impossible to trace. Across Eastern Europe and parts of Southeast Asia, Blackshore poured money into massive property development. Towering apartment blocks, glitzy hotels, and shopping centers rose in cities like Tbilisi, Skopje, and Phnom Penh. But something was off. Many of these buildings were completed, furnished, and advertised, yet remained eerily empty. At night the windows stayed dark. By day the streets around them were quiet. These weren't projects designed for people, they were built to launder money. The schemes were clever. Properties were sold between shell companies at inflated prices, sometimes multiple times within a year. On paper they showed massive appreciation, attracting foreign investors, who believed they were entering booming markets. In reality the buildings were often occupied by paid actors posing as tenants, buyers or hotel guests when necessary. Entire ghost cities became financial theaters, created to mask the flow of illicit wealth. But property wasn't just a cover, it was a weapon. With ownership of dozens of strategic sites in major cities, Blackshore gained influence over urban planning boards, local governments, and infrastructure contracts. In return for their silence or cooperation, officials received untraceable payments through consultancy deals or were gifted apartments in luxury buildings that technically had no owner. The money flowed in multiple directions. Construction companies, often owned by front organizations, billed triple the normal cost for materials and labor. Banks processed mortgage loans that never had to be repaid. Insurance claims were filed for staged damage. Every transaction was a mechanism, each one designed to clean money, move assets, and increase the group's presence in the legal world. To outsiders, the developments looked like signs of growth. International investors praised the bold expansion of emerging markets. Governments pointed to the glittering towers as proof of progress, but the reality was far darker. These projects weren't building cities, they were burying crime. By 2018, Blackshore's real estate holdings were worth over $2 billion, spread across 6 countries, and protected by layers of legal fog. Most of them were untouchable. Even when foreign governments tried to seize assets, they discovered the titles were owned by trusts, held in jurisdictions that refused cooperation. The legal teams had done their job well. While Europol analysts chased shipping manifests and weapons routes, Blackshore had already rewritten its balance sheet. The criminal empire was no longer hidden in the shadows. It stood in plain sight, disguised as economic development, praised by politicians, and funded by a fortune no one could trace back to the secrets of Liverpool. As Blackshore's influence stretched across continents, it became increasingly clear that something set it apart from every other criminal organization. It wasn't just the money or the logistics, it was the silence. For an operation of its size, remarkably few people ever spoke about it. There were no leaks, no confessions, no messy betrayals. It was as if fear had replaced loyalty. Those who tried to leave or talk simply disappeared. These disappearances weren't noisy or dramatic. They were calculated, clean and eerily efficient. A former logistics manager in Romania boarded a flight to Vienna and never got off. A software engineer based in Dubai drowned while swimming in calm waters during a private beach holiday. An accountant in Cape Town fell from his apartment balcony the night before he was scheduled to testify in a money laundering investigation. Every case seemed like a coincidence. None of them left clues behind. Inside Blackshore, these were known as quiet closure. The protocol was simple. If an individual posed a risk to the integrity of the organization, either by accident or intent, they were removed. Not with bullets or bombs, but through perfectly staged accidents, overdoses, suicides, or simple disappearances that attracted no headline. No one came knocking because no one had a reason to suspect foul play. Some of the most chilling vanishings involved those closest to the legal and financial frameworks of the empire. A compliance officer in Prague, who had grown suspicious of a string of unusual real estate transactions, was reported missing by her family. Her body was never found. A mid-level lawyer in Madrid began compiling files on property deals he believed were fraudulent. 2 weeks later, his car exploded outside his office in what police called a mechanical fault. The wider world remained unaware. Investigations that started with enthusiasm quickly ran cold. Detectives retired early. Journalists stopped publishing follow-up. In Berlin, a young investigative reporter had begun piecing together a timeline linking Blackshore's shell companies to missing persons across Europe. She never made it to her next deadline. Officially, she died of a heart attack. She was 32 years. The message within the network was unmistakable. Blackshore didn't tolerate threats. It didn't issue warnings or second chances. There were no dramatic confrontations, no names on hit lists, just a void where someone used to be. The organization's discipline was absolute. Every operative knew only what they needed to. Communication was compartmentalized and encrypted. Money was transferred through anonymous wallets and blind trusts. Everyone was replaceable, but everyone was also watched. Betrayal wasn't just discouraged, it was eliminated with surgical precision. Despite growing whispers in intelligence circles, no government could pin anything directly to Blackshore. They had no faces to interrogate, no bodies to present, no proof beyond suspicion. It was as if the empire had created its own rules, and everyone else was playing catch-up. The silence surrounding Blackshore wasn't just a byproduct of fear, it was part of the design, a world where secrets were buried not in darkness, but in plain daylight, hidden beneath the noise of normal life, and in that silence, the empire thrived. By 2020, Blackshore's presence was deeply entrenched in the digital realm, while many crime organizations still relied heavily on physical smuggling and cash. Rennard's empire had embraced a new frontier, cyberspace. This was a world without borders, where money, information and influence could flow invisibly through networks and servers, far beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement. Blackshore's transition into digital crime was not sudden, it had been quietly underway for years. Rennard's team of hackers, once hired to breach banks and siphon funds, had evolved into a sophisticated cyber warfare division. They developed custom malware, created encrypted communication platforms, and built virtual infrastructures that masked their tracks with layers of deception. Unlike typical cyber criminals who sought quick profits, Blackshore's cyber operatives aimed for long-term control. One of their most dangerous innovations was the creation of a private digital marketplace, an untraceable darknet hub, where stolen data, illegal goods, and illicit services could be traded with near-total anonymity. This marketplace wasn't open to just anyone. Access required complex cryptographic keys and personal vetting by Blackshore's inner circle. It became the backbone of the organization's global dealings, linking drug traffickers, arms dealers, corrupt officials, and money launderers in a single ecosystem. Blackshore's hackers also perfected ransomware attacks tailored to strategic targets. Instead of indiscriminately locking files for quick ransom, they selectively attacked government agencies, critical infrastructure, and financial institutions. Their goal wasn't immediate profit, but leverage. By threatening to disrupt essential services, they forced quiet negotiations, extracting concessions or gaining influence over political decisions. These digital blackmails often went unreported to avoid public panic. Meanwhile, their cyber espionage campaigns infiltrated multinational corporations, stealing trade secrets, manipulating stock prices, and influencing markets to benefit Blackshore's vast portfolio. These operations required patience and precision, months or even years of silent observation and data collection before striking at the perfect moment. It was corporate sabotage on a scale no one had seen before, but Blackshore's cyber operations were also defensive. Recognizing that law enforcement was becoming more adept at tracing online activity, they invested heavily in anonymization technologies, VPN networks, and blockchain obfuscation. They created false trails designed to mislead investigators, funneling suspicion onto rival groups or innocent companies. When authorities thought they had found a lead, it often turned into a dead end. This digital evolution made Blackshore harder to fight than ever. Traditional police raids and seizures could no longer disrupt the flow of wealth or information. Servers were decentralized across countries with strict privacy laws, and data backups existed in encrypted clouds beyond reach. The empire's physical assets, the warehouses, ships, and buildings were only small parts of a much larger virtual operation. Rennard's vision had come to life, a criminal empire that transcended geography, law, and time, one that could vanish, reappear, and evolve at will.
And while many governments were still focused on catching smugglers and drug lords, Blackshore had already disappeared into the digital shadows, waiting, watching and growing stronger.